CIUT 89.5 Toronto.
And welcome to the Taylor Report, CIUT 89.5 FM. I'm Phil Taylor. Today we're going to be talking about Syria, and we're going to start with the journalist Vanessa Beeley, and I believe she's on the line. Are you there, Vanessa?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I know it's late, and I feel like somewhat sadistic, but keeping you up. But you are the journalist who we love to talk to you because you actually have been there. You were in Aleppo, and now we have a new crisis, and it really, to my ear, sounds like the old one, the one you witnessed in Aleppo. But I want to ask to begin with, there is something called the pocket of fighters in East Ghouta, and they've been there, I understand, since 2012. Well, who are they, and why have they been able to hold on? What kind of capacity do they have? Who are they?
Well, I mean, you have the normal collection, let's say, of extremist and terrorist fighters. Most of them affiliated, whatever their moniker is, affiliated and controlled by effectively Nusra Front. I mean, of course, we know that the United States has been rebranding Al-Qaeda throughout Syria to try and distance it from the terrorist ideology, but it's not worked. People still recognize these groups as being Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates. So you have groups like the Al-Rahman Brigade, you have Jaish al-Islam, the Army of Islam, and a number of other groups embedded, including Nusra Front itself, embedded in these eastern districts of Damascus. Not only Eastern Ghouta is one area, and of course became probably most famous for the alleged chemical weapon attacks back in August 2013. But in these areas alone, I mean, for example, in 2015, these terrorist factions were putting Syrian civilians, particularly Alawites and other minority sects, into cages and using them as a deterrent against the Syrian Arab Army and Air Force attempts to liberate that area back then. We know, as you said, this is a replica of the situation in East Aleppo. In East Aleppo, we had a very small minority of the whole of the city of Aleppo occupied and controlled by the various terrorist factions. In Damascus, you have a very similar situation. The eastern suburbs have been occupied by these similar, if not the same, terrorist factions since, as you said, 2013. And, what is extraordinary, we're seeing this ratcheting up of the humanitarian propaganda right now because these terrorists are now being squeezed. The Syrian Arab Army and its allies has taken the decision that under all circumstances they must liberate this area. And the reason that they're doing that is because there are it's difficult to get precise figures. Some say 6 million, some say 8 million civilians in the city of Damascus. And those include internally displaced people from Eastern Ghouta, from Douma, from the eastern suburbs, who, the same again as in Aleppo, fled the eastern suburbs when the terrorists invaded. So they fled into the main city of Damascus. And those millions of civilians in the main part of Damascus city have almost on a daily basis been targeted by the terrorists in the eastern suburbs with a number of mortars, missiles, suicide bombs, explosive bullets, snipers. And recently I was told when I was there in January this year, they're now using much more sophisticated missiles, actual motor-driven missiles, whereas before they were the crude hell cannon type gas canisters. Now they're using much more sophisticated munitions and missiles that apparently on impact are exploding and releasing, almost like cluster bombs, hundreds, if not more than that, little bomblets, which explode again on contact, either with human flesh or with a building. Mm-hmm. But obviously, when that happens, it's doing tremendous damage to people and to children. I mean, on the day that I left Damascus in January, they targeted school children literally just as they were leaving school. And on that day alone, 9 people were killed, the majority of whom were children. There was 1 3-year-old. And since then, this has been an ongoing tactic. So, you know, we have to ask this question. If this were a suburb of Toronto or a suburb of London or a suburb of New York, and on a daily basis, the civilians in those cities were being targeted and massacred, and particularly in sort of minority community sectors, which is what they're targeting, you know, would we be keeping quiet, or would we be asking the government and the armed forces to basically liberate those areas and release the people that are being held in those areas by the terrorists? Again, exact replica of East Aleppo.
Mm-hmm. And again, this is Vanessa Beeley. You could find her writing, 21st Century Wire, excellent work, and of course, an actual on-the-ground observer of these matters. Well, you raised this matter of Aleppo. Here, I swear, the media was saying the fall of Aleppo. The last heroic men in Aleppo. Well, actually, it has been captured by the government of Syria, and it has been reunited. I'm going to use the word liberated. And what they were telling us, we almost had to go to start World War III to prevent the terrorists from losing control of East Aleppo. So what is East Aleppo like now?
Oh, I mean, Phil, it's extraordinary. You know, I mean, it's sort of it's so inspiring. I mean, I was back there, like, as I said, in January this year, and I'd been back during the year after its liberation. And I mean, you know, to describe this as anything other than a liberation is really a distortion of the truth. Over 800,000 people have returned home inside Syria in the last year alone. And the majority of those people are coming back to Aleppo since its liberation in December 2016. Even for me, going back to East Aleppo, say, for example, last year and going back in January this year, the difference is tremendous. I mean, life is coming back. You know, people are back sat outside, well, maybe not in January, but they were in August last year, you know, sat on the streets talking, having coffee. Everywhere you go, there's a hive of activity. People are welding, they're rebuilding, they're restoring themselves, you know, and they're brick by brick, stone by stone. They're putting their houses back together, and they're bringing their families back to their homes. The
country is coming back to life. That's the biggest city in Syria, is it not?
Exactly, you know, and people, you know, the mainstream media still tries to maintain this image of a devastated Aleppo. It's not devastated. I mean, in January, I went into the area where the SMEs are based, so all the little textile and fabric factories that were taken over, first of all, by ISIS and then by a number of other terrorist factions throughout the occupation. And I mean, this is an amazing little rabbit warren of factories. It was extraordinary. They're almost on every floor of the building. So you're going, you know, onto the first floor, second floor, third floor, and there's all these little machines running, creating fabric, creating textiles, creating threads. And these people are back running their industry, you know, and absolutely none of this is spoken about. I went to also the Ibn Khaldun psychiatric hospital. Now, this was originally, because it's really close to the airport, it was actually taken over initially again by ISIS and then by a number of other terrorist factions. The mentally handicapped people many of them were executed when the terrorists took over the hospital. Many of the doctors and nurses were also killed. But one of the most disturbing aspects that I heard from Dr. Bassem Hayek, who's the director of the psychiatric hospital, and now it's sort of, again, we're seeing it rebuilding, we're seeing patients coming back. I mean, he said that exponentially the number of patients that they're seeing on a daily basis has grown hugely. But two things that really kind of shocked me about this under the terrorist occupation, those, psychiatric patients, the most vulnerable of society in almost any country in the world, were being used as suicide bombers by the terrorists. So they were exploiting their vulnerability and their inability to judge the situation, to turn them into weapons against their own people. I mean, I was horrified when I heard this. And these are the people, Phil, that our government, our NGOs that are aligned to our government, and our mainstream media are describing as freedom fighters and democracy bringers and rebels.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, it's
feminists too. I think occasionally they're all led by. We actually, it's embarrassing to say so, but the New Democratic Party here issued a statement in which they talked about women leaders in East Ghouta, and
please.
I think they would need a pretty powerful lens to find that.
Honestly, Phil, seriously, no. Now I really have to say something very strongly here.
Please
in
do.
East Ghouta, I urge you to watch Mother Agnes, who does the most amazing work on the ground in Syria, humanitarian work. She has teams inside those eastern suburbs of Damascus. There's also humanitarian just out detailing the gender violence across Syria. And guess where that gender violence is most prevalent? In those terrorist-held areas. Mother Agnes made a statement today. She said that every time one of these areas is liberated, 25% of the women that they deal with, that they try to rehabilitate, that they try to help, 25% of those women have been sexually abused by those terrorist factions that are occupying their neighborhoods. And that includes young children. Okay? So, seriously,
Yes.
please bring one of those New Democrats to East Ghouta and introduce them to those feminists.
That is my favorite project. I intend to work on that one. Vanessa, I want to ask you about this. There's also a terrible misrepresentation of the ceasefire. The document I was looking at, and you're very helpful with all the facts here, because the parties here say, well, there has to be a ceasefire. The Syrian government has to stop bombing. They don't seem to understand the language of that ceasefire. It does not include the terrorists. Am I right?
No, absolutely not. And actually, the UN resolution has been pleasantly vague for a change. It's actually said that the targeting of Al-Qaeda can continue and any affiliate of Al-Qaeda. It's basically quite rightly left it open for the Syrian government, the Syrian army, and its allies. And I have to actually say here and make it very clear, because people are trying again also to portray the sectarian element, which is exactly what they tried during the liberation of East Aleppo. The only forces on the ground that we are aware of in the east of Damascus are the Syrian Arab Army. So the Syrian National Army is the one that is liberating these areas. And actually what I wanted to do, Phil, if I have just a couple of minutes, just quickly run through, because I think it's very important.
Please do.
There's an activist and analyst, Elijah Manier, who's actually just written a very good summary of reasons why this area of eastern Damascus is so important. So I'll just very quickly run through his 4 points, if you don't mind.
Please.
First of all, he states that Ghouta was and still is considered one of the main areas offering air protection to Damascus against any air attack possibly coming in from Israel. Now, we know that that has been an ongoing threat even prior to this conflict in Syria. So the Syrian air defense system has maintained several anti-air missile bases in Ghouta for decades as a crossfire point around the Syrian capital. So, of course, when those terrorists took over that area, it's no coincidence that they took over Damascus's air defense system against Israeli attacks. And it's also, I'd like to make the point here, when we've also seen the Syrian Arab Army making any advances in the eastern suburbs, what happens? Israel will bomb the airbase in Mezeh on the outskirts of Damascus. So there's a correlation between what is happening in the eastern suburbs of Damascus and Israel for certain. Secondly, Eastern Ghouta is the weakest point in the vicinity of the capital, Damascus. And so from here, as I've mentioned, the terrorists and extremists are bombing the capital on a daily basis. So actually, this makes it impossible for any presidential or parliamentary elections to take place because they can't under this continuous threat. In 2014, when Assad won that election, the terrorists were firing mortars into Damascus on a terrifying level. Ava Bartlett and a number of others were there and witnessed and testified to that. So it's important for this area to be cleansed of the terrorist threat so that a resolution can move forward. And any political proposal offered by Moscow to end the Syrian war can move forward without being handicapped by that terrorist entity. So that's a very important point. Third point, ending the war in Ghouta means putting an end to the presence of Al-Qaeda and its affiliates in that area around Damascus. And so this means that those jihadists will be forced to get on the green buses to go to Idlib. But that is also another negotiating moment for the Syrian government to try and release more of the civilians from Kafaya and Fuad, the Shia Muslim villages that are marooned in the province of Idlib and have been starved and besieged and are fired upon daily. So it's a negotiating chip for the Syrian government to basically evacuate more of its people from those villages. And then finally, ending the Battle of Ghouta will free, of course, tens of thousands of Syrian soldiers that can go directly to the southern city of Dada and liberate the border area with Israel. Now, of course, this is also going to generate a reaction from Israel. So I think I would highly recommend anybody listening to follow ElijahManier.com, Magnier, at his blog or on Twitter. He's one of the most insightful analysts that are working on this conflict right now. He's regularly in Syria, and he provides, probably one of the most in-depth and accurate analyses of what is happening.
Well, we're getting that from someone who we regard as very, very insightful and knowledgeable, so we will definitely do that. Vanessa, thank you very, very much. I'm heartened by the interview because I get the sense that the Syrian government is asserting its sovereignty, and that is good news for the world, in my opinion. And we're very grateful to be talking to you.
Yeah, and I think just very quickly, I think the Syrian army news has just come in that they've only got about another 3.5 kilometers to retake before they split the two eastern districts. And that's very important. That's actually, I think, that's what they did in Deir ez-Zor, is they split the fighting factions apart from each other and gave themselves a corridor in the middle. So that also enables them. I think today was the first day that Russia managed to get a humanitarian convoy in there, even through the fighting. So, they're moving very fast, Phil. This is incredibly encouraging as well. They learned a lot from the liberation of East Aleppo, and I think, of course, there is going to be loss of civilian life, but the ultimate liberation will ensure that more civilian lives are saved.
Yeah. Well, it's music to my ears. Thank you very, very much, Vanessa, and look forward to talking to you again in the future. We're sorry we kept you up late.
No problem. Thanks, Phil.
All right. Bye-bye. That was Vanessa Beeley, and this is the Taylor Report. It is CIUT 89.